Sarah Osborne was born Sarah Warren in Watertown, Massachusetts Bay Colony. Her first marriage must have seemed rather advantageous at the time, for she married a prince of a man, Robert Prince, to be exact. Now this is where it gets a little complicated, but try to stick with me here. Robert Prince's sister had married Captain John Putnam of the famous and soon-to-be infamous Putnam family of Salem Village. Robert Prince was close to the Putnam family, having lived his whole life as their neighbor, and now, of course, through marriage, but still being a kinsman of the Putnams. More proof of his close ties with the Putnam family can be found in the fact that he named John and Thomas Putnam Sr. as the executors of his will, which is a fact that, as you may guess, will become very important momentarily. Sarah moved to Salem Village to live with her husband, and eventually the two had children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. Unfortunately for Sarah, her husband Robert died in 1674. In his will, he stated that the farm, a 150-acre property in Salem Village, should be saved in a trust for his 2 sons. But Sarah was not content to play the weeping widow for very long, and what she did next would blacken her name in the village and, perhaps, create some very deadly enemies. Shortly after her husband's death, Sarah bought the contract of an indentured servant from Ireland, a man by the name of Alexander Osborne. Rumors began to swirl around the village that Alexander was doing more than helping around the farm. When Sarah and Alexander eventually married, just 3 to 4 years after the death of her first husband, the scandal was doubled. Not only had Sarah married a servant, but she had lived with him as man and wife before they were married. The fact that they were now married did not reduce the stain on her name. The newly remarried Sarah further upset social norms when she made a legal claim to her deceased husband's farms. Of course, this went against what Robert Prince had written in his will, and so the executors of that will, the Putnams, refused to sign over the land to Sarah Osborne and her new husband. After all, the farm had been willed to Robert Prince's children, and they were Putnam nephews. And so began an unbelievably lengthy legal battle between the Osbornes and the Putnams. It was a dispute that had still not been settled by the time of the witch trials, some 15 years later. In early 1692, the first of the afflicted girls began having their fits. See this video here if you don't already know about that. It started with 2 girls who lived in the home of Reverend Paris, the minister of Salem Village. The girls were, of course, Abigail Williams and Betty Paris. The next 2 alleged victims of witchcraft were Ann Putnam, who we will call Ann Putnam Jr. because her mother also becomes very involved in the trials, and her name is also Ann Putnam. They like to reuse names. Gets a little confusing, so we'll call her Ann Putnam Jr. And also Elizabeth Hubbard. Elizabeth Hubbard was the niece of Dr. Griggs. Dr. Griggs was the man who was believed, although we don't know for 100% sure, we believe he is the doctor that came to the Paris household to examine the afflicted girls, Betty and Abigail, and declared that they were not ill with any treatable medical condition, but were in fact under an evil hand. At first, the girls either could not or would not say who was bewitching them, but eventually, after much pressure, all 4 agreed that it was not just one witch, but in fact there were 3 witches in Salem Village, and the girls were ready to name names. The girls accused the slave Tituba, the frightening beggar woman Sarah Good, and that quarrelsome old fornicator, Sarah Osborne. So now the natural question becomes, why would the girls have named Sarah Osborne? And of course we can think of a couple reasons why this might be true. First of all, let's just go with the story that in fact Sarah Osborne was a witch and she was bewitching these 4 girls. Personally, I don't find that very likely. I don't believe there are witches with these kind of magical powers. As the Witchfinder General of Salem, Massachusetts, for several years now, I can tell you I have stood on the streets of Salem yelling at witches, both people who claim to actually be witches and people just simply dressed up for a good time, and many of them have tried to lay some kind of curse upon me, and so far I'm feeling just fine, thank you. Another theory, and one that I'm sure crossed your mind, as it does many people because this makes for a great story, is that the adults in their lives, particularly the Putnams, who were powerful allies with the Paris family, the Reverend, who had a lot to be worried about in this particular case, since these witchcraft afflictions started in his house, and he was not a super popular minister in the village to begin with. So him and Putnam, the story goes that they kind of conspired together, and they pressured the girls, and they said, girls, when they ask you who is bewitching you, you're going to name Sarah Osborne as one of those people. Because, of course, she had made a nuisance of herself. She was an enemy of the Putnam family. She was involved in this lengthy legal dispute with them, and just wasn't a very popular person herself, and they just kind of wanted her out of the way. That could be true, or it could be that the adults, were thinking of quarrelsome people that they knew, and they said, without blatantly saying, you're going to say it was Sarah Osborne, they could maybe have just said, do you think it was Sarah Osborne? She's been out to get our family a long time. Do you think it was Sarah Osborne? Do you think she might have had something to do with this? So that could be too. Personally, I think that, maybe that could be true, but I don't necessarily think they needed that to inspire their accusation of Sarah Osborne, because probably in the case of Ann Putnam Jr., she had heard Sarah Osborne's name in the house many times, and probably not in a very flattering way. And of course, the story that, her husband died, and then just a little while later, she brings over this Irish immigrant, and they start, playing house, as it were, before they were married, which maybe isn't such a big deal now, but in Puritan New England, that was a very, very big deal. In fact, it was a sin, a terrible, terrible sin. And so that would blacken her name. So there's this woman who lives on the edge of town who is very mysterious. By the way, she was a sickly woman. She'd been in bed, bedridden, for at least, I think, a year before all this went down. And so now there's this mysterious woman that you hear about, but you don't really see. She doesn't come to church. And there's all these rumors about her past, and every once in a while, your dad and uncles talk about her and what a nasty woman she is and how she's trying to steal land from your cousins. So, I don't think she necessarily needed the adults to say, like, oh, you're going to say Sarah Osborne. She might have just, when pressured to name a name, or when legitimately, maybe not bewitched, but legitimately fearful that she was being bewitched, kind of caught up in a living nightmare, then it's not too hard for me to imagine that she would say, Goody Osborne. Whatever the reason, on February 29th, 1692, 4 men, including Ann Putnam Jr.'s father, Thomas Putnam, traveled from Salem Village to Salem Town to formally make legal complaints of witchcraft against Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. With these complaints filed, the Salem Witch Trials were about to officially begin. And now a word from my sponsor, which happens to be me and some of you. I enjoy making these educational and hopefully informative and entertaining videos for you about the Salem Witch Trials, and I hope that if you come to Salem in October, you will stop by and say hello to your old friend, Witchfinder. I am usually found on Essex Street, out near the Peabody Essex Museum. But another way that you can say hello to me is by joining the Patreon, patreon.com/witchfinder. There you will find exclusive video content and some other kind of post. I also host a podcast called Spooky Times with Eric D. We talk about the Salem Witch Trials sometimes, and we also talk about all kinds of other spooky subjects, some serious, some silly, and if you're into that kind of thing, I think you'll like it. So look for it wherever you get your podcast from. Spooky Times with Eric D. And of course, you can follow me on my social medias, like this one. Thank you to all my patrons, and now let's continue learning about the life of Sarah Osborne. That very same day, February 29th, 1692, local magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne issued arrest warrants for all 3 women and ordered that they be arrested and brought to the Ingersoll Ordinary, or Tavern, the next morning to take place in a hearing. If you watched my video about the outbreak of the Salem hysteria, you'll know that although it was scheduled to happen at Ingersoll's Tavern, in fact, the crowd who had heard about these witches being accused was so large that they couldn't fit everybody in the tavern, so they moved it down the street to the Salem Village Meeting House. Sarah Good was examined first. Meanwhile, Tituba and Sarah Osborne were made to wait outside the meeting house. We don't know exactly where they were made to wait, but most likely back at Ingersoll's Tavern or perhaps at the guard tower just across the street. During her examination, Good denied that she had ever dabbled in any kind of witchcraft, but on her saying this, the afflicted girls in the courtroom began to scream and writhe in their seats and on the floors. Magistrate Hathorne turned to Sarah Good and said, "Do you not see that these girls are afflicted? Do you deny that they are being tormented by witches?" Sarah Good agreed that it did indeed look like the girls were being tormented, but said that she had no knowledge of who could be doing it, except that it wasn't her. After repeated prompting, Sarah Good eventually said, "You know what? I don't know. Maybe it was somebody else that you brought in here with me today. Maybe it was Sarah Osborne." Now, why would she have named Sarah Osborne? Well, of course, really to take the pressure off of herself. She was just done being asked the same question over and over again. But also, it's possible that she didn't know Tituba's name. She did know, at least in passing, Sarah Osborne. Good was sent to prison, and of course you can learn more about her right here. And Sarah Osborne was brought in next for questioning. Unlike Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne was not a disheveled beggar woman. It's true that she had not been to meeting, aka religious service, in well over a year, but there was a reason for that. She was very ill. In fact, as I said earlier, she had been bedridden for the better part of the past year. When she stepped into the meeting house that day, Sarah Osborne was probably relatively sure that her witchcraft trial would end rather swiftly and that she would go home shortly, maybe even that very evening. She was wrong. Judge Hathorne questioned Sarah Osborne much the same way as he had Sarah Good, but unlike Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne refused to implicate herself or any of her co-defendants in any kind of witchcraft conspiracy. When Hathorne informed her that Sarah Good saith that it was you that hurt these children, Osborne gave a rather peculiar-seeming reply. "I do not know that the devil goes about in my likeness to do any harm." What she meant by that was, hey, if the devil is going around disguised as me and hurting other people, well, I don't know anything about it. It's a remarkable statement in that it brings up one of the most important theological questions that would be asked throughout the entirety of the Salem Witch Trials. Does the devil have the power to take the form of somebody else's spiritual shape, aka specter, without that person's consent or knowledge? With her statement, Osborne became the first, though certainly not the last, to question the reliability of so-called spectral evidence. Hathorne asked the 4 afflicted girls to step forward and positively identify, if they could, that this was the same Sarah Osborne who had been tormenting them. All 4 girls agreed that it was indeed the very same Osborne who had been one of the witches who had been tormenting them. In fact, they pointed out, that Osborne was wearing the very same clothes at this hearing that her specter always wore when it came to torment these girls. 3 unidentified witnesses then stepped forward to announce that sometime after her arrest, they had heard Sarah Osborne say that she was more likely to be bewitched than to be a witch. Judge Hathorne asked Osborne what she meant by this. Osborne explained that she had either saw or dreamed she saw, that is how she phrased it, a figure like an Indian, all black, burst into her home, pinch her by the neck, and drag her by the hair to her own front door. Judge Hathorne asked if this was an isolated incident or if this menacing figure had ever returned. Osborne said no, she had only seen it that one time. Another unidentified witness stepped up to report that some time ago, Sarah Osborne had complained to him of having dealt with a, quote, lying spirit. Osborne admitted that there had been a time when she thought she heard a voice telling her not to attend religious services. Fearful at first, she agreed and said she would not go to meeting. However, when the next Sabbath day came, in spite of her fears, she attended the Sabbath meeting. She said she never again heard the voice after that. But Hathorne knew that Sarah Osborne had not attended meeting in quite a long time, and so he asked her, "Why did you yield thus far to the devil as to never attend meeting since?" "Alas," cried Osborne, "I have been sick and unable to go." Her husband and some neighbors of Sarah Osborne stepped forward to confirm that indeed she had been very ill for a rather long time and unable to attend meeting. This was an acceptable excuse for missing meeting. However, Hathorne declared that there was enough strangeness in this story of Sarah Osborne that she should in fact be held in prison until she could stand trial for the witchcraft charges placed against her. With that, Sarah Osborne was led out of the Salem Village Meeting House and placed into the Salem Town Jail. Tituba was questioned next, and her testimony would become the spark that would ignite the flame of the Salem Witch Trials. Facing immense pressure, at first Tituba denied all charges against her, but eventually she began telling Hathorne what she thought he wanted to hear, and thus she became the first of the accused witches to confess to actually being a witch. She claimed that she and her fellow defendants were guilty of witchcraft, but she also said there are more witches still at large. Tituba would go on to claim that there were at least 9 witches in Salem Village, but when pressed for further detail, she claimed that the specters of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne came to her at that very moment, forcing her mouth shut and blinding her eyes. She could say no more. We will learn much more about Tituba in an upcoming video. Questioned in Salem Village Jail over the next several days, Sarah Osborne continued to insist that she knew nothing of any coven of witches in Salem Village. Eventually, she was moved to the Court Street Jail in Boston, which, in 1686, was described by one writer as a, quote, suburb of hell. She was kept locked in heavy chains in a basement dungeon through the coldest part of the year. For 9 weeks and 2 days, the already ailing Sarah Osborne lingered in that dungeon until both her body and her spirit gave out. She died in prison on May 10th, 1692, having never faced trial for the charges against her. Because she did not face trial and was not executed on Gallows Hill, Sarah Osborne is often forgot as a victim of the witchcraft trials. She is not listed on the monument to the victims in Salem, Massachusetts. But make no mistake, Sarah Osborne was truly the first victim of the Salem witchcraft trials.